Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. Today, I am joined once again by Dr. Keith Witt for another episode of The Shrink and the Pundit. Hey, Dr. Keith.
Hey, Jeff, how you doing?
I'm good. How you doing?
I am doing great. Always good to talk with you.
Likewise. You're really having quite a presence on Integral Life now. You're doing a regular thing, right?
Every month.
You're being a shrink?
Live with Dr. Keith.
Is that right? And there's one tomorrow.
Yeah, there's one tomorrow. We're doing one tomorrow on the 2 commitments in relationship.
Cool. Well, people will be listening to this later, except for the live people. So what is it? Once a month, and it's just on Integral Life, and you can go look and join in, and you take questions.
Yeah.
And it's popular.
I love it, and I love the interactive part of it.
Yeah.
It gives Integral is a diverse community all over the world, and so. When it gives us a chance when people can call in and talk to you or call in and talk to me on one of these things, it gives us a chance to connect each other. Like what's happening in the European conference right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's cool. All right. Well, so let's turn to our topic today.
Yes.
And I'm excited about this topic because it's one that we don't talk about a lot. It's sort of this redhead stepchild of the, Aqua model. And we're talking about types. And the Aqua model, just for people who are kind of new to this, is the model that Ken Wilber has come up with that sort of explains what it is to be human. And it's made up of these 5 dimensions: quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types. We won't get into all of it. But types is, it's something that we just know intuitively about each other, and we talk in terms of somebody who's an introvert versus an extrovert, or somebody who's grounded and just likes to work on things and make things happen that are like real, versus people who are kind of spacey and like to think about ideas and then the people who are, care about people's feelings, and people who are not so concerned about feelings, but really want results. People who want to nail things down, people who want to hang loose. And, here we all are. And we sort of come out that way. And we show up that way. And your thesis and your thinking on this is, well, first of all, it's a little bit new, right? You said we were talking before we got on here that this is something you've been thinking about, in a new way. So maybe we just start there.
Yeah. I've been thinking about it in a new way because a lot because of the work that I've done recently in trauma and intimacy. And so the people who develop typology systems are, if you've ever developed a typology system, so different people do. I mean, I developed a test once. You validate it, and you get all excited when your typology system actually reflects people being different systemically, that their personalities are different. The Myers-Briggs people were super excited that they could reliably test people's personality, so they'd have the same measure. And the Enneatype, people who do the Enneatype, we love the Enneatype. We love identifying our Enneatype and so on. And they get invested. They say, well, if you're a type, you're kind of stuck being that type. And that's been the accepted wisdom around personality for 100 years. Mostly because what people have observed is that your personality is observable very, very, very early in infancy, and then you can see a progression. And so there's this sense of, okay, people's personality develops, but there was this unconscious bias towards it happens individually. It's like this personality growing, not recognizing that the personality grows in an elaborate set of interconnected relationships starting from before conception. And that these interrelationships are not neutral interrelationships. There are better ones and there are worse ones. And what that turns into is it affects our type as we grow. And at a particular point, we're kind of stuck with who we are unless we decide to change. And the radical approach to individuality is, okay, I'm totally responsible for who I am, and if I have a problem, I'm responsible for it. And if I have a problem in the social framework, then I should take care of it, and it's my issue. And all that stuff is true from the perspective of human beings are way too powerful to change unless somebody decides they want to change and grow. And also it's true that we don't really change certain aspects of who we are. We can grow them to be progressively more healthy. You know, you're an Enneatype 5, I'm an Enneatype 6. I can get to be a healthier and healthier and healthier Enneatype 6, but, I'm never going to be an 8. I'm just not going to be an 8. I'm not attracted to all the things that 8s are attracted to. And, you're not going to be a 3. You're just not going to do it. Okay.
Right. But I can be an ever healthier 5.
Yes, you can.
And then there are, the idea of the Enneatype that a healthy 5 grows into an 8, and a healthy 6 grows into a. I mean, there's a
healthy 6 grows in integration. The 6 goes to 9. Under stress, the 6 goes to 3. Yeah,
and under stress, I go to 7.
Yes, you do.
And this is a little inside baseball for people, but this is the Enneagram, and the Enneagram is actually one of the popular typologies that you find in the integral world. It has a rich history, and it has sort of a spiritual quality to it, and
absolutely.
And that's one of the things that I sort of got stuck on. You were talking about that this happens before conception.
Yeah,
and I have a feeling you're going to talk about because of the state of your parents.
Yes,
but I also want to see if you're talking about just the karma that we bring in from God knows where.
Well, first of all, I think that is well said. We bring in karma from God knows where. I don't know where because, I'm not God, other than to the extent that all of us are God, okay? But something else comes in, and that's fine. And also, progressively, as soon as I have self-awareness, I'm responsible for all that stuff. We are responsible for everything we experience and do. And, development is not fair. Some people are brought in with more skills and less skills. Some people are brought into a more comfortable environment and a less comfortable environment. If you're in a low socioeconomic, if you're a child in a low socioeconomic family, you're 4 times more likely to be prescribed antipsychotics than a child in a middle-class family. Okay, well, that's not fair, but that's just the way it is. And so we have to deal with the fact that there's those elements. There's the elements of our parents' health and their psychology when they conceive us. There's the psychological and physiological environment of the mother. There's birth and the first year, the second year, the third year, which are just packed with critical periods. Critical period is a period where the organism, the child, needs certain kinds of development, certain kinds of input from the outside that develop certain kinds of capacity. And if you miss that period, you don't adequately develop those capacities without great effort. Okay? This is why feral children who didn't learn language because they were being raised by wolves, and there's actually a few kids that had that happen in India, they could never adequately develop language, but they did develop some language later on. And part of the new thing that I have about this is that, and it's a cultural, this is a wicked problem that I wanted to discuss. Not that I have any solutions to it, but it's a wicked problem. We know now what optimizes that developmental arc for that infant from before birth to adulthood. I mean, it's not theory anymore. It is, we know what's better or worse for infants. We know what's better.
And what are the 2 or 3 things that, really we want to put on the table that make all the difference?
Okay. So here's one. You want a child to have a secure attachment with a primary caregiver, like a mother. About half kids have that. And you want the kid to grow up in a secure environment where there's cultural support and there's enough food, there's enough shelter, there's enough security, and there's a reduced amount of anxiety. So you want a kid growing up with parents who are functional and coherent and with enough of that stuff, and given the opportunities to grow and develop, and given the stimulation at the appropriate developmental times. We want that. That's a big deal. We do not want that child to have abuse and neglect. Okay? We don't want that. And generally, that is pawned off to somebody else. People do not take responsibility for protecting infants and children from being abused and neglected, and this severely compromises their personalities and their type of person. You know, you and Warren Farrell had this great talk. Boy, did I have fun listening. I like him and I like his book. And he talked about 85% of guys in prison didn't grow up with a dad.
Okay, let me just stop you here. Warren Farrell, I interviewed last week. He wrote a book called The Boy Crisis. Mm-hmm. And it's about how boys are falling behind in, 60 measures of well-being relative to girls. And, there's a systemic problem here. And that, the sort of thesis is that, and it actually was Gail Sheehy wrote it on as one of the blurbs on the book, and I love Gail Sheehy, is that, she's proud of what happened with the women's movement in terms of expanding options for women. But the same thing didn't happen for boys. Yeah. And boys are stuck in this sort of, sort of arrested development in terms of evolution. And sort of a meaninglessness that is turning pernicious in ways that we are now just beginning to realize. So I just want to put that in the table, and I'm glad you like that.
Loved it.
So that's what you're talking about.
Yes,
sort of.
Well, if you look at the people who are incarcerated, 50% of them were in foster homes. 90% of them were addicted to something when they were arrested, and 80 to 90% of them were actually loaded on something when they were committing their crime. What predisposes people to have those kinds of problems, like addiction, like loss of control? Childhood abuse and neglect, that's what causes it. And what causes childhood abuse and neglect? You don't have adequate support for parents and for children. And I think one of the things about the boy crisis is the vast differences between boys who had a father in their life and boys who didn't.
Well, that actually is the one thing. Warren Farrell said, if I had to boil it down to one thing, it's did they have a father or didn't they?
Did they have a father? Think about it. If you had a father in your life, there are two people who are biologically, psychologically invested in you. And what that means is that they're answerable to each other. Most of us act better when we're feeling like we're being observed. And if there's another caregiver around, we're more likely to be self-regulatory. Single teenage mothers, 85% of their kids are evaluated as being overly aggressive by the age of 2. That's a cultural pathology with those teenage mothers. Why? There's not a guy around, one thing, and 2, they're all by themselves and nobody's really supporting them. One of the most infuriating things about the pro-life movement that basically coerces pregnant girls into having babies is after 4 or 5 months they cut them loose. We don't want to take care of them with small babies. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah. Well, let's just look at it developmentally. I mean, you talk about the solution to the problem is more support for mothers and for kids,
families and kids. Yeah.
Yes. And I agree with that. And that's a sort of a developmental move forward. The conservative critique of that is actually, no, the solution is to go back to the pre-sexual revolution where parents stayed together and, enough of all of this experimentation and all of your crazy ideas, you liberals, and, sit up straight and do your job and be responsible.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who's done therapy for 45 years, I gotta say, those kinds of pronouncements just fucking drive me crazy because I've worked with those people. I've worked with people in their 60s who come in and the guy doesn't know where his wife's clitoris is. Okay, well, so much for the good old days when it comes to, people knowing about how to love each other. When I was a kid, it was considered good parenting to humiliate children. It was the Marine model. Don't have them feel too good about themselves. My coaches would all tell us we were worthless and all this other stuff. Well, research has shown that the number one thing that creates psychopathology, more than sexual abuse or physical abuse, is emotional abuse of children, telling them that they're worthless or you can't stand them or they're, that kind of stuff. That creates more psychopathology than anything. How come we as a culture haven't looked at all the problems that we have as a result of this and say the solution to these problems is starting with this generation? If we could not have these children be abused and neglected, we would have hundreds of billions of dollars of added revenue from taxes, hundreds of billions of dollars less spent on healthcare, and we'd have half the psychopathology and half the addiction that we have today. These are staggering effects. All have been validated. Oh, there's this great woman, Carolyn Lyons Ruth, on the East Coast. And so she got a bunch of teenage girls who had their kids. These kids that by 2 years old are all diagnosed aggressive. She had a nurse who knew about development visit these girls and their babies once a week. That's all they did. They showed up for an hour or two, taught them how to play with their baby, listened to them, changed the baby, went back and forth, how to ask them how it was going, talk to the other people. All right, 6 months later, half those kids didn't have symptoms anymore. Okay, 6 months. This is the least expensive intervention that can be done with infants that anybody's discovered that has the most robust effect. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the weird thing about this. There have been at least 3 of those programs that have been started, and they go for a little while, and then they're defunded. How does that happen? Well, it happened in the same way that we're seeing now the Trump administration going back to abstinence-based sex education. Somebody gets in charge and they go, we don't want to be a nanny state. We're not going to give money to these teenage girls. They shouldn't be getting pregnant. Screw them. We'll end this program. Okay, well, stuff like that is really hard for me because everybody that I see, basically their issues come from some aspect of childhood trauma or neglect or adolescent trauma and neglect.
It's just as you talk about this, just in even this program you're talking about, just the power of being seen.
Yeah.
Just the power of just being seen for who you are and contacted by another human being in a very basic way, a parent, a father, a mother. And, War and Fair talked about, there are situations where the father isn't an option.
That's right.
And there are ways of compensating for that. But we have to know what we're dealing with and what's needed. And, and that's how we sort of work our way forward here.
And this reminds me of the one thing he said that I disagree with. Okay. And this is what it was. He said, well, we should have teenage boys babysitting more so that they get used to working with kids and know about kids and infants and so on, which I understand. I babysit my cousins when I was a kid. But I've had too many stories of kids being molested by teenagers. And so I would never have a teenage boy, babysit my children. Why? I couldn't be sure of what's going on with him sexually because we are taught to keep that invisible.
Right.
Now,
and that drives these male advocates crazy. Mm-hmm. The idea that all boys are tarred with that, and that boys are, it's just like the way gays were seen.
That's right.
It still are, actually, by a lot of people. You don't want to leave your kids alone with them.
Yeah.
And,
Now, the answer...
But yet I see the intelligence of it, too.
And the answer isn't to say, okay, boys can never be childcare workers. No. The answer is to make everybody's sexuality more visible. The answer to that is to have the reality of childhood neglect and abuse more visible and more part of the daily conversation. Because once it's visible and part of the daily conversation and everybody talks about it, they're no more likely to sexually abuse your kids than they are to take a stick and hit your kids with a stick.
Right.
Why? Hitting people with sticks is something that's visible and that we don't let anybody do, and that people don't do, and no babysitters do, and that's just all there is to it.
But they used to.
Yeah,
It's so funny. I had my reunion with my cousins, and we were talking about. Actually, let me just extend the story a little bit. So I have my trainer who I work with 3 mornings a week, and he's great, and he's young, and he's got this about to turn 4-year-old. And this little girl is very willful, and they spend a lot of their time just trying to get her calmed down so they can talk to her and move. And they're all doing all the right stuff. They're really smart parents. They're very good parents. A lot of time, a lot of frustration. And so I just comparing that to my cousin's reunion, and they're all in their 60s like me. And we're talking about that when we were, in the backseat whining, our mother would reach back and backhand us.
Yeah.
And we all laugh about that. We all loved our mothers and fathers, and and some were worse than others, and whatever. But boy, what a difference! And if my trainer or his wife were to do something like that, and somebody were to see that, they would call the cops.
That's right. And
so I do want to mark that as let's note the progress, Keith.
Absolutely. This conversation is a mark of progress. There is a guy, I forget his name, Frenzy, I think, in the 30s, who wrote this article. And, this is a psychologist in the 30s writing an article. He said, there's a problem inherent in development. Children are love machines. Adults are love and sex machines. And he said, when you combine those, adults that don't have adequate self-regulation will seek sexual regulation out of those loving relationships. He was trying to draw attention to the problem.
And this is in the 30s?
In the 30s.
Wow, cool. Interesting.
He was excommunicated from the psychoanalytic community, and stayed in disgrace the rest of his life. In a psychiatric textbook in the 80s or 70s, they said incest happened in 1 in a million cases, and it wasn't that bad. Okay, everybody's a therapist is fond of quoting this statistic because they go, yeah, I guess I must have had all the incest victims in America come through my office.
No, incest was a feature of pre-modern societies. My goodness, it's what you did.
It was, except that there actually are genetic inhibitions around having sex in your family. Children.
Yeah, but fair enough. But there was a hell of a lot of incest happening, and that's still true.
That's true.
In terms of the pre-modern countries today.
That's true.
In terms of world statistics.
That's absolutely true. And it's a problem. Often that happens in sexually repressive cultures, which adds insult to injury to development, which brings us back to our type conversation. Okay?
Yes. Where did the types go?
Well, the types are types develop as we develop, and there's certain aspects of our typology that we can change, and there's certain aspects that we can't change. And
there are certain aspects that are a result of different kinds of traumas?
Yes. And neglect? Yes.
Okay.
And the way that those are resolved generally is in creating open intersubjectivity where everything can be discussed within the context of cultures where everybody is safe and secure. Okay. That's what heals human beings and causes them to grow to be the healthy version of their type.
Oh, God bless you. I mean, how simple is that?
Yeah. Yes.
It's so good. So anyway, all right. So let me look at myself here. So just using the Enneagram. So I'm sort of centered around a 5. Uh-huh. I know that to the degree that I really flourish and become the Jeff that I can be, I'm going to be more towards an 8, which is leadership. And, getting people roused and all that good stuff. As a 5, I'm a thinker, I'm an analyzer, and that sort of thing. When I'm unhealthy, I'm a 7. I'm a dysfunctional 7. I'm jittery. I'm with the remote. I can't settle down. I'm thinking of this. I'm trying to entertain myself. I'm whatever. I can't focus. And so how I'm raised, how I'm nurtured and seen will sort of get me off to the higher set point, maybe.
Yes, absolutely. And we see that in some of the teenagers and young people that have had this over the last 20 or 30 years, because a lot of this data has been available. And you and I have been commenting on this for years. They're extraordinary. They're way farther along than we were. Why? Because they do have a higher set point. Now, what that means, practically speaking, is that people are in interpersonal relationships where they can be themselves and talk about anything, and their basic nature is honored while they're getting the boundaries that they need to be pro-social. Now, one of the huge...
Keith, say that again. They're getting the boundaries to be pro-social.
Yeah. Okay, so let me explain that. Okay, there is a bias. This is a child-centric culture, particularly in the middle class in America these days. Now, there's several problems with being a child-centric culture. Okay, one problem being a child-centric culture is that parents tend to attend to kids, and they tend to sacrifice self-care and care to the relationship to attend to kids. Okay, that's a problem because what kids need more than anything else is a couple of parents who are functional, loving each other. I mean, that's basically, if you got a couple of parents who are functional, loving each other, you're more likely to be set up. Secondly, it's good that kids are attended to in terms of what their nature is. But secondly, particularly boys, push against boundaries. Some kids, by nature, push harder against boundaries. Boys tend to more than girls.
Some types do that.
That's a
typology right there.
There's a masculine-feminine breakdown and another typology. They need particular kinds of boundaries when they do that. The boundary is you are not allowed to behave in a non-pro-social fashion. And then after you calm down, we'll have a little talk about it that will validate your feeling but not validate the behavior, and a little bit of social learning will take place. If that doesn't happen, then it tends to amplify self-indulgence and narcissism in the kids. But there's a lot more other variables. Fathers. If fathers do rough and tumble play with their sons, and they're authoritative, not authoritarian, which means they don't let anybody get hurt, those kids have better social skills and are more self-regulatory later on in life and have better attention skills. Okay, so if a father isn't around to do that, that little boy is going to have less attention skills. And 10% of little boys are diagnosed ADD, and a lot of them are given speed. Now, I have a problem with that. One of the problems with it is I don't like giving amphetamines to 8-year-olds. I mean, come on. And secondly, those drugs are anti-play drugs. They inhibit play. Children need to play to develop. That is the crucible through which they discover the world and each other. And I don't want to be giving kids antipsychotic drugs, which inhibit play and cause obesity, or I don't want to give them amphetamine, which inhibits play, because now they're not engaging in the kinds of behaviors that they need to engage in. And these are important social behaviors to optimally develop as virtuous types of whoever they are. And going back to type again for this, children that are sexually abused, for instance, are affected physiologically and psychologically. Physiologically, it infects their development. Girls that are sexually abused tend to have their periods a year and a half earlier and have 3 to 5 times as many sex hormones as girls that weren't sexually abused. Now, I don't know if anybody listening can remember when they were 13 or 14. Whoa. Well, my sex hormones when I was 13 or 14 were driving me crazy. And the idea of having 3 to 5 times more of them, makes me want to just shoot me, So, and these girls, because they're weird, they don't have friends that help initiate them into pre-adolescence. It predisposes them to be exploited. Girls that have been neglected or abused are 7 times more likely to be raped. One of the problems they're having when they get girls out of sex trafficking is these girls have only had a sense of validation for being beautiful and sexual, and now they need to have an awful lot of relationship and support and so on to develop a self that has a sense of purpose beyond that. And it's our responsibility as a culture to provide that for everybody. If we do that, everything changes for the better. And we've seen this happen in small enclaves, and we've seen it happen in the Northern European countries, which aren't perfect, but have done a lot of this stuff. And then, so when I see things like Trump wanting to go back to abstinence-based sex education, which is a disaster, instead of going with progressive pro-sexual sex education, which is great for kids, this is how our type is affected by our interactions. And it's very, very fluid. For instance, being likable and not likable. These are definable characteristics that can be taught to children and that can change, okay? But it only can change if we're paying attention to it and we see it and we help them and we don't hurt them.
Right.
Okay.
I don't know if you saw Bill Maher the other night, but he had Jordan Peterson on.
Oh yeah, our favorite, our current favorite.
Yes, the
green
public intellectual. Yeah, so he was doing the interview, and Jordan Peterson, of course, wrote this book, The 12 Rules for Life. And one of the ones, and the one that Bill Maher wanted to talk about was, don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Wow, that's interesting.
And I like that. And Bill Maher liked that really a lot. So they actually talked a lot about that. And it's what you're saying about likability and you know, so what I'm getting from this in general, Keith, is that first of all of this matters, and we really, as a culture, want to take this seriously.
Yeah.
And there's lots of ways to do it, but there's, you know, some tried true ways of, you know, the two parents who are there and whatever. But that culture has a responsibility to step in when that's not working. And in so doing, you know, heals a lot of the trauma that really comes home to roost in, you know, I mean, let me count the ways.
And let's go back to Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
So yeah, like I said, he's everybody's, you know, green basher, you know, pluralist basher. But okay, we don't want kids to do stuff that causes us to don't like them. All right. What if I've been raised in an anti-sexual environment and my kid acts in a sexual fashion? That makes me not like him. Okay, so I say, stop doing that. You know, basically denying his sexuality. Okay? Well, what happens then? It goes inward. And now instead of getting support to develop a healthy sexuality, that kid is kind of left on his own or with whatever friends he can join with.
Yeah.
Now, the only way to deal with that is to have a cultural understanding that we want to raise our kids in a pro-sexual fashion, you know, a pro-healthy sexual fashion. That's how can we do that? Well, we can have the sex education not be abstinence-based, which is a failure, and be a pro-sexual understanding, information, relationship-based, which has proved to be successful in Denmark, in Holland, and other places. And then now we have parents that are primed when the kid does something they don't like. It's actually something that needs a boundary, like hitting another kid.
You are the most libertine monogamous guy I have ever met in my life.
Yeah, I think monogamy kind of protected me from a series of sexual disasters that would happen.
But you're right. I mean, I love this idea of prosexual.
Yeah.
It's like prosexual. And, you know, then, you know, with the baseline of we like sex, we know kids are sexual, we want everybody to be thinking appropriate with it. How are we appropriate with it? What are the moves at various stages and various ages?
Well, and also the idea that addressing childhood sexual trauma, look, 28% of girls, 16% of boys are molested by somebody 5 years older than them. I mean, that's 20% of the population, okay? The idea of addressing that by creating a more pro-sexual culture is going to drive conservatives crazy.
That's counterintuitive, Keith.
It's counterintuitive to Western, you know, Christianity is not a pro-sexual religion thinking, but that's exactly what the answer is.
It's true.
That's exactly what the answer is. And so that's the way that we protect them from being molested. Where a pro-sexual culture talks about sex. Sex is more visible. Sex is more visible than the main thing that supports sexual abuse, which is keeping it invisible. That begins to degrade, and kids are better protected.
Right on.
The same is true with emotional abuse. Like I said, emotional abuse is omnipresent, and it causes most of the problems. you know, there are people in mental hospitals. You talk to people who run mental hospitals, they go crazy over this kind of stuff. Why? Over 50% of the people in mental hospitals had childhood trauma experiences. Okay, they call it, what do they call it? Developmental trauma disorder is the diagnosis that the APA refuses to put into the diagnostic manual. Which is another.
What is it again? What's the diagnosis?
It's developmental trauma disorder.
Okay.
And with kids who've had multiple episodes of neglect and trauma tend to develop a lot of problems, behavioral problems, substance abuse problems, sexual problems, you name it, acting out problems. They get all these diagnoses. But the bottom line is it came from developmental trauma, and the APA will not put that diagnosis in the manual. Why? It kind of legitimatizes the fact that most of our problems are caused by kids not being treated well developmentally. It's a cultural thing. It's not like psychopathology happens, you're growing a tumor. It comes out of a system, and as long as the system stays the way it is, it's just going to keep pumping out the same amount of problems in psychopathology and obesity and all the other kinds of things that we talk about. And we can't affect that system only working with infants. Infants are symbiotic in relationships. We need to affect those relationships. And those relationships, like with mothers, are symbiotic in relationships with fathers and families. We have to affect those. That's the only way that we can adequately address. It's a wicked problem. We can adequately address these things and help kids grow to be the healthiest version of whatever type of kid they are, which is what we want.
That is what we want.
It is what we want.
Yeah. Well, to look at it through the whole developmental spiral, we have over time, you and I have seen this in our own life, how children are more seen.
Yeah, they are.
Cared for than ever in a certain way. But there was this sort of atomization that happens in modernity where people move away from the extended family, and there they are, they're stuck in an apartment, and there's nobody, and then that feeds on itself. And so we see that as sort of a developmental hiccup, more than that probably. And then we move into, and I think we have a bifurcated society. David Brooks talks a lot about this.
He does.
The way kids are being coddled and treated and, nurtured in the middle and upper classes is a whole other ball game than the way they are in the lower classes.
And there's problems. There's 6 times more depression now than there was when we were kids. Depressed mothers tend to produce kids that feel neglected. Okay?
Yeah.
So if we want those kids to not have the subjective experience of neglect, we got to help those women who are depressed.
Yeah.
Social isolation, as I've said millions of times, is the biggest health risk in the United States.
You have said that. That's a good point. Yes, indeed.
And so, we still have those vestiges from modernity and post-modernity that need to be addressed more systemically. And, people don't have a lot of room to create community when they're worried about whether they're going to have food or whether they're going to be able to make their rent payment. And similarly, upper-class kids have just as many problems as lower-class kids, interestingly, but they're different kinds of problems.
Really? How so? How would you see the difference there?
Well, what the research says is that the upper-class kids will have the same level of psychological and behavioral problems as lower-class kids, but the lower-class kids' problems have to do more with survival. Getting caught for weapons, that kind of stuff. The upper-class kids will get busted for shoplifting or for,
drugs, drinking,
that kind of stuff. And there's a real critical time in upper-class society in America, around 12 or 13, where those kids are in hyper-competitive environments, those schools. The kids that do well in those schools are fine. The kids that don't do well begin to feel like failures and start giving up. And that's why there's a disproportionate amount of suicide in some of the most elite high schools in this country.
Wow.
And when I have upper-class clients, luckily when I get them when they have babies or little kids, I start preparing them for that and saying, what we want your kids to be is outliers of that culture. We want them to be successful, but not so driven that they develop anorexia. We want them to feel good about themselves, but we don't want, that kind of stuff. And because you have a lot of resources. Part of your issue is to teach your kid about how to handle resources. Like when my kids went to college, I told both of them, I said, okay, each one of you is going to have to come up with $6,000 a year for college. And they said, well, how am I supposed to do that? I go, well, there's a lot of ways. You get a job, you can borrow money. And, well, how do I do that? Well, we'll help you, but you got to come up with that $6,000. So after college, they both had the subjective experience of working their way or borrowing their way through college. Now, they didn't know that I was kicking in an extra $25,000 a piece every year. They felt, they had that autonomy and they had enough anxiety so that they both were pretty good about managing their money. Okay. I didn't do that because I wanted their $6,000. I did that because as a parent, and I didn't want them to feel entitled to their experience. I wanted them to have the subjective experience of worrying about it a little bit, working about it, so that it would stimulate them at a critical period, which 18, 19, and 20 is a critical neurological period, so that they could develop more of a sense of self-responsibility in the world. Okay, now the data about all this stuff is available, and each time you do one of these things right, your kid becomes a healthier type of whoever they are.
Mm-hmm.
Our responsibility is to help everybody be the healthiest type of who they are, both with our family and with everybody else. And you're really right about social disintegration. And so a lot of time when people are having babies, I always tell them, you got to find other families with people you like that have kids. And here's another example. Okay, kids need to play with other kids to have healthy development. Parents need to participate. Parents, when kids are 2 years old, you need to take them around to other kids. And 3, have play dates, but you need to be right there resolving issues. By 5, kids start choosing their own friends, and parents are about 12 steps away, and they only intervene if there's a problem. At 13 or 14, you have a relationship with kids where you've told them that they can talk about anything, and they have. So they have their social experiences and then come back and process them with you. If you try to have the same attitude at 14 that you should have at 3, your kids develop a lot of problems. Or if you have the attitude that you should have at 14 at 3, those kids don't get the right kind of input from parents. So these helicopter parents really are not getting the data that they need to optimize their child's development because they have these presupposed notions and they're all taught that they're supposed to be great parents as soon as their baby's born. Nobody's a great parent when your baby's born, but there's a lot of data about being a great parent if you're willing to receive it and grow as a parent. Now, culturally, this isn't a standard yet, that a superior parent is someone who does their best to protect and love and cherish their child.
How about the rest of us too, Keith? I mean, I think of our listeners here, and some of them are active parents right now, but a whole lot of them are grandparents, or they know kids, they interact with kids. I'm getting just this sense of I really want to just see a kid. When I'm with a kid, I want to see who they are. And I don't know, what could we do?
Well, first of all, what you're doing, understanding kids from the inside of their own interior. Here's the integral again. Ken's saying Flatland took us away from interiors. What do children need? People that are interested in their interiors and communicating to them what's going on with them in their interiors. 4 months of age, what does an infant need? You need a kid that's a parent that's present, that's contingent and congruent, and that's marked, meaning, oh, you're happy, you're sad, like that kind of stuff. Letting the kid feel known, accepted, and protected. That dynamic, the kid being known, accepted, and protected, and the parent being present, congruent, and marked in that fashion, creates securely attached kids, which sets up that kid's type to be more secure. Okay, so on every level, treating a kid with respect, but understanding their interior is going to be different from ours. That's what does it. And also with children, let me see it at almost any age, but especially younger children. There's times when they can relate like this, and there's times that they need a boundary. Okay, that's just all there is to it. Now, this is also true for grown-ups. You can relate or you have to handle them. But, I can't walk away from my kid like I can walk away from a grown-up who's acting badly. So it's my kid, if I can't talk it out, I have to set a boundary. And I have to set it firmly and kindly. And then I need to not blame the kid for making me set a boundary. And then when the kid shifts over into a more pro-social mode, I need to be able to approve of them and love them. This is very difficult if the kid, for instance, has problems that are like the problems I had when I was a child or I had when I was traumatized. If I was sexually abused, for
because
instance,
you get triggered, because you lose yourself.
yeah, I get triggered, I lose myself. Okay. And so how do you deal with that? Well, as Ken says, the answer is to wake up. But if we have a culture that normalizes the waking up process at every age, which is what we in Integral keep promoting and projecting, what that does is it creates open systems, raising children or having grandchildren and that kind of stuff, where we're doing the best we can. We're always receiving new input about how to make everybody healthier and happier. The people that are listening to this podcast, almost by definition, you're seekers who want to keep growing the rest of your life. That is setting you up to be a healthier version of your type. And when you're relating with children and being aware of their interiors or adolescents or young adults, to support them having a lifetime of growth also. And that becomes an assumed quality of the environment, of the intersubjectivity. It's not something we have to decide. It's just something that we live.
What if kids make you kind of nervous?
Yeah, they do.
No, I'm personally not the called to that in a certain way, but I'm noticing a couple of my friends who have really, so-called adopted these kids whose parents are working and overworked, and boy, it's really satisfying to them, and it's really, really helpful to the kid.
Yes.
And I'm happy to, I donated a computer.
Yes.
So
you did your part.
That's how a 5 helps. And I think about it.
That helps.
That helps.
The worst sessions that I've ever had, I mean, the most painful for me personally, have been sessions where an 8 or 9-year-old has hijacked the session.
Oh, boy.
Okay, so they're too big to be contained physically like a 4-year-old.
Right.
Okay, they're too young to be related to. They put up their barrier and start acting badly, and okay, session is hijacked. They have a perfect barrier up. And so when that happens, I go, okay, so much for family therapy. I got to work with the parents to be able to adjust the family culture so that this kid can develop to the point where they don't do that anymore.
Right.
Those have been my worst favorite.
Yeah. I imagine you've had your share of that. Having, 50,000 private therapy sessions? Am I right there?
It's 65,000.
Jesus. Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So you've seen all this up close and personal.
Yeah, I have. Nobody's seen it all. One thing that stands out to me about types is that every single person is a unique type of person that draws from the other systems, and that it really does matter. Whether someone says, "Okay, I want to be a healthier version of myself." And again and again and again, as a therapist, I've had to help people go back to previous episodes of trauma, of neglect and abuse and so on. And I'm always really happy when someone comes in who's pregnant or has a little kid, because I let them know, okay, we want to optimize this child's development, and there's a lot of things you need to know, and I'm going to tell you. And some people listen and will practice that stuff. And it's a couple came in, a couple got pregnant, okay? This is a fun story. Okay, there's this couple that came in, and she was trying to convince me what a horrible partner she was. Oh yeah, I want to go fuck other guys. I'm this, I'm that. I'm a terrible person. I go, no, you're not. I could tell. She's a brilliant, solid woman, and she's falling in love with this guy. Okay, so I said,
I like her already.
Yeah, I said, so first of all that stuff's bullshit. I see that you're a solid, competent person. You're falling in love with a good guy. Okay, so more power to you. So then I said, yeah, no, I'm not. So they came back in. They said, well, actually, now we're monogamously committed, but I'm pregnant. I go, okay. So I told them, so this is what you need to do to attune your baby. When your baby's 8 or 9 months old, come in and visit me. I'll teach you about how to go through, the next level of development with them, the play period from 10 to 17 months. Okay, so they showed up last week with their 8-month-old boy. Okay, this was a secure, happy little 8-month-old baby, Jeff.
How sweet is that?
I crawled around in my office, tried to eat my cords and stuff. That's okay. At 8 months, they're still slow enough you can stay ahead of them. Forget about it when
you
they're
could spray that stuff that they do for dogs on those cords.
No,
probably,
you don't do that.
Probably do the trick.
See, there you go. They're not dogs. You don't spray that stuff.
All right.
That stuff has chemicals.
I'm sure you did the right thing.
Anyway, this adorable baby. And I went, okay. So the first 8 months now have been taken care of. He's secure. They're dialed in. Now they're set up for the next year. Okay. So there's a lot of problems that kid could have had that you didn't have.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And they were appropriately working at being better with each other because, as I told them and as they knew, your relationship with each other is part of the container of your child. In America, people don't realize that. You need to take care of your friendship and your love affair. That's a big deal. And if you're not, get help from somebody like me. Okay. And take care of it. Your child needs that more than giving him another violin lesson. Okay? Now that's where the child-centric thing starts screwing up kids' development. They're service receivers and parents are service providers rather than children are citizens of a family. Citizens have responsibilities.
Yes.
Citizens have rights and responsibilities. And in that family, in that culture of that family, we're all growing and we all have something we're working on and we all have our authority and our responsibility. Okay, so that's a different consciousness than parents or service providers. I got to focus everything on the kid. No, I need to focus on our culture. And it's got to be a healthy culture. And that means me as well as the child and me and my husband or wife as well as the child and we in our larger culture as well as the child.
Well, and I love that idea that they're citizens too. And they have responsibilities.
Yeah.
Appropriate to their age, all that good stuff. But that really is different.
It is.
And, I have no regrets about not having kids because I would have been the worst kind of service provider. I mean, I just want to give them whatever they want so that they, I don't want to, it's like my parenting strategy as a dog owner. It's simple. I try to see to it that they never have an unpleasant moment. That's it. That's my sort of touchstone.
So yeah. It would have been hard for you to allow them whatever suffering. That was hard for me as a parent.
I'll bet.
When my kids had
that's got to be tough.
When they were going through age development suffering, it was hard for me to take a deep breath and allow them to go through it. Still to this day, it is, and support them and go, and development is hard under the best of circumstances. And part of understanding what type of person I am is I have strengths and weaknesses, and part of my job is to work on honoring my strengths and developing in the area of my weakness. And if I grew up in a culture where that was standard, it's a lot easier for me to, accept whatever type I am. I'm a fear type. I grew up in a culture where being afraid was shameful. Okay, so I grew up in it with endogenous shame up the yin yang. And so, of course, there you go. And so,
fear type.
And so I became a counterphobic 6. And so I would take stupid risks. And I was just lucky that I'm alive. Okay. But if I was raising that,
I was a counterphobic 5. I would think about taking unnecessary risks.
There you go. Well, I wish my 5 wing would have been stronger then. I wish that would have worked for me, particularly in my late adolescence. So anyway, now one thing about the integral age that's coming is we are at a place where the information and the data and the wisdom is really available.
Isn't that something? I mean, just you could almost feel the changes happening in real time in the way we think about all sorts of things. But this, I feel like I'm learning about raising children. I feel like I learned a lot about it in the last hour. I mean, really. And that's just it's just magnificent.
Yeah, I am so interested in the fact that we love having our minds changed. That's a developmental milestone. I've talked about it before. Yes. I didn't used to like my mind changed because I was all fixed mindset, invested in knowing stuff and my way being the best way. Well, I've now realized that nothing that I do is the best way.
Yes. Exactly. I mean, I sometimes joke when I talk about typologies. I sometimes joke that, I mean, what typologies first of all taught me that I was wrong when I thought that everybody was a defective version of me.
Yeah, right.
Which is what I thought for the first 20 plus years of my life. And then I realized, wait a second, no, they have a different antenna. They see, they process. Wow. And then it becomes like, wow.
Types.
You know? And then
the revelation of types.
And that is the gift of that.
Yeah.
That you start appreciating all these people who you thought were conspiring to annoy you. You know,
they're not. They're
not. They're just being themselves. And then ultimately you get to one of my favorite quotes from Emerson, where he says that ultimately every church has a congregation of one. And that each of us, we could find these constellations and we can see these patterns, but in the final analysis, we're all just unique.
Yes. And, A.H. Alma's wrote a book about the Enneagram called Facets of Unity. And I love A.H. Alma's. Who doesn't love A.H. Alma's? I don't know. And so his hypothesis is his position in Facets of Unity is that we lose our connection with spirit. And so different people then, that creates a hole. We feel an emptiness in that. And so we essentially try to fill up that hole with our personality. And so his belief about the Enneagram is that our personalities were created with the progressive distortions that we came up with to try to fill that hole. And that his approach to that was, what is the basic connection with spirit that we've lost? Let's make that connection. Now, my belief is that that's how it works. That we all have a basic, Patricia Albert calls it the origination point, and in the East they called it Atman. Okay, that there's this little point, and that point coming up through our incarnation creates the unique person that we are. Now that point gets distorted and corrupted by abuse and neglect and trauma, and so part of our job is to recognize that and to prevent that if possible, and to heal it when it happens. And part of that is our own desire to grow as a seeker. So we want to simultaneously work on these practices and things to grow and expand and so on, while when the trauma and the other stuff shows up, we address it and heal it, while taking a stand for let's create a culture where as little of that is inflicted on kids as possible. Everybody's going to get some. But, what if that 28% and, a third of kids are hit to the extent that they're left bruises by a parent? What if that was 5%? What if that 20% molested got down to 2%? What if that 1 in 8 kids who've seen their mother struck or beaten up turned into 1 in 100 kids?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, that would be great. We would have hundreds of billions of dollars more tax income. We'd have hundreds of $billions less incarceration and mental health stuff, and we'd have a lot happier, healthier people.
Yeah.
But it's a wicked problem because we can't just work on it. We have to work on it with food. The food industry is not supporting this. You cannot feed kids high glycemic index sugar and expect them to feel good in their bodies. They don't feel good in their bodies. Or put them in environments where they don't get to exercise, or they don't get to dance, or they don't get to sing, or they don't get to create art. They don't get to play.
Yeah. I remember getting a pillowcase full of candy on Halloween.
Oh, my God.
I mean, I don't know how I'm still alive. I mean, and actually, if I may, Keith, because we're getting in the end of time here, shift it to, really quickly to those of us for whom that ship has sailed and we've already got all of our traumas and it's, whatever. I just want to say that the 2-part series that you and I did on healing trauma is one of the most popular things on my site, thedailyevolver.com. So if you're interested in healing the traumas, which is the other side of the street, because, we can't uncook that egg for some of us, those are great.
Oh, yeah, I love that.
It's part of the Shrink Independent on dailyevolver.com.
Check it out, people. And also, in the next year, I'm going to have a book called Trauma into Transcendence, an integral approach to understanding and healing trauma that will take a lot of the things we discussed and expand them because it's a big deal. And And we in Integral look at things from multiple perspectives, and more perspectives you look at stuff, the wider your view and the more opportunities and choices you have. And that grows us. Just that process itself grows our consciousness.
Yes, it does, indeed. And thank you so much for carrying that torch, man.
I'm carrying the torch.
You are. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate us having these conversations and putting this stuff out into the world.
Putting it out there. So, thanks everybody for listening. If you are interested in giving us some feedback, we love hearing it. I'm Jeff at dailyevolver.com. Pretty simple. Keith, you are?
Well, you can email me at keith@drkeithwitt.com. You go on my website, drkeithwitt.com. And you can, leave a question or a message in something. And check out my books. Going back to the current thing, I kind of dismissed my previous work often. So I went back and started reading Waking Up, which was my book on integral informed psychotherapy. And I was surprised how much I agreed with everything. I went, wow,
surprised how much you learned.
Yeah, this is a good book. You know, so it's, even though I have a better understanding than I did when I wrote that book, I had a pretty good understanding when I wrote that book. I mean, so, there is such a thing as, moving forward. So you go to my website.
Right. And you really have, so mapped out the territory of integral psychology. And, you will have a marble bust in the integral pantheon.
Woohoo!
So there. Okay, everybody. Thanks again for listening to the Shrink and the Pundit and the Daily Evolver, and we'll see you next time.
Much love to everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.